In this video, I want to show you how to produce a true crime podcast. The Frankston Murders is a podcast written and narrated by award-winning true crime author Vicky Petratis, and it uncovers new materials and victims stalked by a serial killer, Paul Denia, in the lead-up to his killings. On appeal, he was granted a 30-year minimum sentence. Then, 30 years later, this year, he appealed for parole. Vicky, who wrote a best-selling book, The Frankston Murders, has created this long-form podcast to remind people why Denia should never be released. Now that's the official synopsis of the podcast. The show is 11 episodes long, and CaseFile Presents team helped to produce it. I was in charge of sound production as well as music. So in this video, I'm gonna go through my sessions, the decisions I made, and how we've ended up with the final mixes. We're gonna start with editing process, we're gonna talk about music, we're gonna talk about scoring, and then of course, how we approach the final mixes. Let's do it. Vicky recorded around 40 people for the show. These were family, friends, investigators affected by Denia's crimes. What we usually do is we create this list of all the people, of the characters that take part in a show, and as you can see here, that's what we've done. We split in episodes into these rows and then put an X in which episode people appear. So for example, when Gloria appears in episode 1 and 2, in episode 1 then I do the EQs, compression, or the settings. When she appears in episode 7, I know that I then need to copy the settings from episode 2 or episode 1 rather than, remixing it and doing it all over again. How it worked was that Vicky recorded all these people on location, over the phone, over the internet, and then she recorded herself in the studio, back her niece edited dialogues, and then sent the stems, the dialogue stems, to Anthony, who's our editor, and then he's done the sort of prep for me with the dialogue cleanups, RX, etc. Now we can have a look at Pro Tools. That's what he sent me. So I had the originals untreated on the top. These were the dialogues that he prepped for me. That's episode 1, and it's called Dial. So I'm looking at the dialogue in first pass. What I'm doing here is a pacing cut. So I'm listening. I try to find the rhythm for the dialogues, the gaps, the spaces, maybe make them longer, maybe make them shorter, as well as tweaks, further cleanups, and also thinking about stuff like dynamic range and so on. So as you can see, there's a lot of cuts on these clips. That's because I'm moving them, I'm muting some stuff like breaths here and there, and also manually affecting the gain. So I'm using few tools to change the gain. As you can see, a lot of cuts. This is the pacing cut that I've done, and yeah, I'm not filling it with any ambience or room tone yet. So I'm using compressors, I'm using transient shaper as well to even the dialogues. It's a great tool for it, as well as of course my RX and modules in RX, leveler to even out the dialogues, and of course denoise, declick, and others that will help me to tweak and prep these dialogues further. When I write music for podcasts, I approach the process slightly differently that you would do if you're working on a TV show or a film. So rather than writing the cues, the musical cues to a particular scene, I listen to rough cuts if they're available. I will read the scripts, I'll talk to the producers, and then I will write the themes and create the sound library of the music for the show. During the scoring process, I will then pick and choose from these cues and mix them in to the podcast. Then I will also select a piece of one of the cues and then create the main theme from the show. It will function as an intro and outro more than likely, and it also will pop out throughout the series. So let's have a look at the sessions. Let's talk about music. I had a few cues that I've written for some other show that I didn't use, and these were more orchestral, more cinematic, And I feel that for Vicky's podcast, for her voice, this kind of sound really works. It's a little bit bigger than I usually do, but I do have few tricks, and then sort of I make it so well, in my opinion, it fits into the show. So as you can see, I had 16 different cues, mostly orchestral. So written and then orchestrated for woodwinds. We had some brass, not a lot, strings, and then piano. And we also had some damage 2, as well as synth based. So the main cues were orchestral with some synth based and percussions. And I usually use a mixture, so I layer the Ulbion one, which is just your full strings, with your single instruments from BBC Orchestral, and I do the same for the woodwinds and for the brass. Now, so this was version 1 of all the cues, right? So 16 sort of orchestral cues, big sound, and a mixture of sad music, more uplifting action music with a lot of ostinati, and so on. From these orchestral cues, I've then created 2 other versions of each cue, and these were more ambient with some synth basses, some rhythms as well. So softer cues that I could then use in the background rather than, sort of big orchestral sound. And for that I use Omnisphere. It's disabled now, but yeah, so that's version 1. And then we had version 2 as well. So they differed in sound. So all the cues and instruments from Cubase are then mixed down. So they go through group, through auxes, and I mix them down into stems. I import the stems into Pros because that's where I feel more comfortable mixing. And as you can see, you will have 3 set of cues. So these are orchestral, that's version 2, that's version 3, Omnisphere, more ambient ones for the background. And yeah, so we got our woodwinds, brass, percussion, so it's all named, easy when we get to scoring the episodes. And I also have a couple of reverbs, so that will be Space from Avid and Cinematic Rooms. So I'm doing a quick premix on these cues, so EQ, compressions, and so on, so I don't have to do it during the scoring process, and I'll show you how that looks in a second. We didn't have much time for the scoring and mixing. The deadline was quite tight, but the job needs doing. So let me show you the approach that we took, the decisions that we made, and how we finalized the episodes. Right, so the last but not least, we got our scoring, we got our mixing. Now this is draft 4, which is the final session, and I want to show you how I do it. So from the stems, musical stems, I import all the cues and then the reverbs as well. And then I will decide where to place the cues, putting the markers at the top, breaking, Denia, Julia, whatever. And I'm also deciding what kind of cues, what kind of music I want in this scene. As you can see, it is a mixture of orchestral, and it's a mixture of the other 2 versions, which are more subtle in the background. What I do then is using my Avid S1, which is my controller. I will show you. I'm running the automation on each of these cues and mixing them to these scenes. So as you can see on this one, I'm not using the woodwinds, I'm not using the percussion, I'm not using the rhythm, and yeah, just part of the cue really is used for that bit, and then the same with others. So it's just kind of mixing the layers that I have within that cue, not just smashing everything at the same time, right? I'll go through each episode doing so, and I listen a couple times to each of these mixes. There's always changes to be made. Now, once that's done, I will select the cue, of course, disable all the mastering, and bounce it into a stereo stem. Let's me hide the musical stems. I mean into a stereo file, stereo track, and I call it score. So that's the whole mixed cue that I've just showed you before, but I mix it again, playing with the automation to that scene, and this will change many times. So I'll keep adjusting the volume automation of that music till the very end, checking on different systems, different headphones, and so on and so forth. So that's what we're doing when it comes. Oh, and we also have the theme, but essentially we had an intro theme, an outro theme, again mixed to the episode, into the dialogues. And the melody from the theme appears throughout the series. It's like a main melody that I came up with. Now, let's focus on the dialogues. So, some of the dialogues are a little bit more noisier than others. Not in this particular episode, but in some other episodes. The music, it has a few functions. So, of course, it adds the emotion, the emphasis on parts of the story, but also, especially for podcasting, this type of podcasting, when the narration, when the interviews, the recording is not great, or maybe it's noisy, it's lacking the low end, I am using soft background music to fill these gaps, to make it whole again. It can cover some issues. I found that especially the subtle background music can hide a lot of problems with audio, and it just works great. So yeah, when I'm doing the music for this podcast, because it's not like films when you'll have scenes when there is no dialogue and there is some action going on or fights or whatever, and then the music plays a completely different role. In podcasts, there is dialogue, there is narration all the time. Like, there are no pauses. I mean, I do create the pauses for some effect, but pretty much there's the dialogue throughout. So the music plays a few functions, not just the emotional one for me. Okay, mixing the dialogues quickly. I don't want to keep you for long. Obviously, the narration had a lot of work done, even till the very end, as you can see, all these cuts that I've been doing. But now, of course, all the gaps are filled with the room tone that we've created. They have their phase, etc. And the breaths were lowered, the gain adjusted. I'm using EQ, couple of compressions and transient shaper to work the dynamic range, gulfos, soft on that mid frequencies. Then we got a denoiser and a gulfos that works as a de-esser, so it only affects tames anything about 2 or 3K depending on the dialogue. A little bit of reverb, that's pretty much it. For the rest of the people, the tracks that were recorded, the interviews, it's usually very simple case of EQ, compression, transient shaper, denoiser if needed, and de-esser, again, gulfos if needed. All of it goes through a stereo bus. On the stereo mix bus, I do have neutron, and it's just a very soft EQ, compressors, but as you can see, I'm only through mixing 40%, 30% of these compressors, and these are kind of soft as well. I have my gulfos master, but only 10 and 10% just to add that polished sound, and of course inflator to make it all bigger and louder. And then we're looking at ozone, simple EQ, a little bit of the vintage tape, so 1.5 dB, tiny amount of exciter, and yeah, I did use spectral shaper on this show. It's not a tool that I use very often, but I had to do it for a few reasons. Mostly it was due to noise on the narration. It had a nasal sound to it that I want to get rid of, and of course our maximizer, -16 I'm running the threshold. On it, I had my tonal balance control here, my insight, and then of course, sound ID reference. Draft 4 of the show was final draft, and just before I finalized the mixes, I gave the show very last listen, and that was on my AirPods Pro. Then I've exported the files as 192 kilobits per second, MP3 and WAVs, but it's the MP3s that are uploaded to the servers. Now, before I upload the episodes, I'll take all of them, all 11 of them, import them in one session, and then double check everything. I'll double check the loudness, I'll double check the sound, and I also double check how the waveforms look. I know people say, okay, our ears and hearing are the primary tools in this job, but you can learn a lot and you can spot a lot when you just look at the waveform as well. Once I was happy with everything, then, like I said, I took all the files, added the metadata, I've uploaded them onto Audioboom dashboard. We've also created some promotional materials, so ads, as well as the trailers. Instead of writing separate music for these assets, I used the cues that we featured in the show. The biggest lesson from this show was that the source recording is always the key. I know it's an obvious lesson, but we've got to remind ourselves about that, because if you get it wrong at the source with the raw recordings, fixing it later is incredibly difficult and time-consuming. And there were some issues with the narration, and it took time to sort them out. So for the next one, we'll definitely pay more attention how it is recorded so the sound stays consistent throughout the series. But other than that, it was a great project. We've learned a lot, we got it done. Like I said, it was a tight deadline because it had to be released before the parole hearing. With each project, we get a little better. We improve, we learn new tricks, we learn new techniques, and then new lessons that we implement into the next show, because perfectionism is the enemy of progress. Thanks for watching. The Frankston Murders is available anywhere you listen to podcasts. Check it out. I'm sure you'll like it.